All right, so hard bottom subtidal communities. So you have either sand that can be on the bottom in this coastal ocean, or you have like rocks and stuff that can be underwater in this area. And if it's rocks, you've got a hard bottom subtidal community. And typically, those rocks and stuff are really just an extension of the land out into the water, the rocks and stuff that are on land into the water. But sometimes it can be made up of other things like worm tubes or like oysters and stuff like that. Bless you. One of the things that you can find in the coastal ocean on a hard bottom type of substrate is a kelp forest. Okay, so that would occur in a temperate and subpolar region. Okay, so you get kelp forests occurring in temperate and subpolar regions. And so the reason why they're found in temperate and subpolar regions is because kelp must be in water that averages less than 20 degrees Celsius. So what was the average temperature that we needed for coral to be in? Greater than 20 degrees Celsius. So kelp must be in water that is less than 20 degrees Celsius. So we find coral reefs in hard bottom substrates in the tropics, and then we find kelp forests in hard bottom substrates in the temperate and subpolar regions. So everywhere that's in color on this map, the red, the green, and the blue, that's where you can find kelp forests. Okay. Notice there's some areas, like right here by Chile off the coast of South America, and then like down here on the northern part of Africa, where like, and on our coast, right, where some of this color kind of like leaks down like into lower latitudes than you would think it would. Yeah. So remember last semester when we talked about gyres and currents, okay, and the gyres are the big like whole ocean basin currents. So these gyres get started by the trade winds, and they move cold water from the poles, and they move it towards the tropics, and they take the warm water from the tropics and they move it towards the poles. So this whole like gyre thing is actually what's going to be pulling some of this colder water up the coast of like South America or like down our coast and allowing for kelp forests to live in these areas. It's one of the factors. Okay. You also get like upwelling and stuff that occurs here because of, yeah, lots of trade winds and stuff. But that's one of the things that will affect it. All right. So you get kelp forests on hard bottom substrates in temperate and subpolar regions, and definitely not in the tropics. Okay, so kelp, you have different types of kelp forests depending on where you are on Earth. So different kinds of kelp will form kelp forests depending on where you are on Earth. So if you are in like Asiatic areas or in the North Atlantic, you're going to have a type of kelp called laminara. That's this picture on the left. Okay, that is going to be the type of kelp that will form the kelp forest. But if you're off our coast, okay, or you're going to see like macrocystis, which is the picture right here. That's the giant kelp. Okay, it's called giant kelp, and that's the type of kelp that will form kelp forests on our coast. All right. So depending on where you are, you'll have different kinds of kelp that will grow. And as you can see, they're very different, and so you're going to get different kinds of communities that can live in these two areas. See that? Okay, so let's look at what kelp absolutely must have in order to grow and to survive. Kelp absolutely must have a hard place to attach to. It has to have a rock to attach to. Even if that means that it's like a rock that's surrounded by sand, it has to have a rock. So it must have a hard place to attach to. It also must be in cold water, averaging less than 20 degrees Celsius. And it also must be in water that is very nutrient rich. Okay, very nutrient rich. So lots of nutrients, cold water, and a hard surface to attach to. All right. So these kelp will attach to the hard surface, and then they start to grow. And when they grow, they actually form two kind of like divisions in the kelp forest, or two kind of like general habitats. You have the canopy and the understory. The canopy is made up of the big giant kelp, and it's the top part, and I'll kind of show you a drawing here in a minute. And then the understory is everything underneath that. So you have your canopy up here. You notice it's like all this macrocystis, like super thick, okay, lots of kelp up here. And then all of this down here, this is the understory, okay? And in this area, you're going to find things like seagrasses in those in the sand that might be around the rocks where the kelp are. You're also going to find like a lot of red algae. Red algae likes to live here, and other types of algae as well. But for the most part, the canopy will be made out of the macrocystis, and then you'll have other types of algae living down here. Okay, so here's what happens. Kelp will attach to a surface like a rock, okay, and it's got to hold fast, right? It doesn't have roots, so it's got has to have a hard surface to attach to. So it attaches to the surface, and it starts to grow. Okay, and it goes up towards the surface of the water, and then once it reaches the surface of the water, it keeps growing. But kelp doesn't have, support structures, and so it doesn't like grow up and out of the water and like stick out of the water. It keeps growing, but it lays on the surface of the water. Okay, so when you get a bunch of these kelp fronds all growing next to each other, they keep growing on the top of the water. They all kind of like lay out on the top of the water and create this thick canopy at the surface. Does that make sense? Okay, and then the understory down here is going to be a little bit more open space. All right? So that canopy up there will have different things living in it than the understory down here. And just like a tropical rainforest, right? The tropical rainforest has a canopy and, understory, same thing with the kelp forest, just in the ocean. Okay, so these kelp forests are going to create lots of different habitats for different things to live. So they can live in all sorts of different areas. On the kelp, in the holdfast of the kelp, in the water column around the kelp, on the rock next to the kelp, many different places. So in the holdfast of the kelp, you'll actually get, you can get hundreds of animals that can actually live in a single holdfast of the kelp. It's kind of crazy. Types of things that you would find here, you would find things like brittle stars, little crabs, worms, isopods. Okay, they're all going to live here in the holdfast of the kelp. And they live there because it's a very protected place. Right? The kelp has this kind of like tangle of a holdfast, and they can get into those cracks and crevices and hide from predators. On the rocks that surround the algae, or that the kelp are attached to, you can get things attached to the rocks and living on the rocks around it. So you'll get things like sea stars, sea urchins, sponges, lots of different things. Abalone, lobster, anemones that will be living on the rocks around the kelp. You can actually get things that live on the kelp itself. Okay, if the things that live on the kelp itself are called epiphytes. Okay, so they're living on the surface of the kelp, and I'll show you some pictures of these. But bryozoans, I'll show you a picture and you can see what they look like. Live on the surface of the kelp. You have the kelp crab, the kelp limpet, and top snails. Okay, bunch of different kinds of snails that will actually live on the surface of the kelp itself. And then if you have like rocks, and those rocks are surrounded by sand, you can actually get different things that will live in the sand that surrounds the rocks. So you can have seagrasses, but you can also get all sorts of like fish and anemones and snails and clams that will live there as well. Okay, so lots of different areas. Here's a few pictures. So right here on the upper left, okay, these are like the arms of brittle stars that are sticking out of the holdfast of the kelp. This is like a feather duster worm sticking its gills out. You can kind of see like the yellow stuff right there. That's the holdfast of the kelp. Over here, see these white things? Okay, these are bryozoans. This is a up-close picture of a bryozoan. And then see this picture right here? It's like the kelp kind of looks fuzzy. Okay, those are actually the bryozoans on the kelp. Okay, so you get things that actually live on the surface of the kelp. And then we've got our isopod, okay, our kelp limpet, and our kelp crab. Okay, so all of those things live on the surface of the kelp, And then these guys live in the holdfast. Okay, so you also have fish that will live here. But the fish are mainly going to live in the water column, so like in that understory area. Okay, you can have lots of different kinds of fish. The Garibaldi, big orange one, that's the California state fish. Okay, you'll find lots of those in kelp forests. So fish in the water column, and also mammals. The types of mammals that you'll see are things like sea otters and like harbor seals, and the California sea lion can also be in here. Okay, so those are the types of mammals that you would see. You don't really see birds, particularly like in the understory of the kelp forest, because birds, in order to capture the fish, they'd have to dive down underneath the canopy to catch the fish, and then when they would try and come back up through the canopy, they get entangled in all of like the fronds of the kelp, and they would drown. So you don't really get birds in a kelp forest like diving down into the understory. So they may sit on top and eat anything that's on top, but they're not going to like dive down. Okay? So in that water column, in the understory, you get mostly fish and mammals. And pictures, so you can see a bunch of different kinds of fish, and then, you know, your sea otter, which is also the keystone species of a kelp forest, right? We learned that. And then harbor seal over here. Okay, so